Hey Kipsters, it's Mrs. Walsh. Today we're going to start reading our next text together, which is the Watsons Go to Birmingham. Yesterday, Miss Outlaw did a video giving some background information for what's going on at the time when our story takes place. So if you haven't watched that video yet, go ahead and stop this one and go watch Miss Outlaw's video and then come back so we can jump into our reading together. When we talk about fiction stories, we often talk about CPSL, character, problem, solution, and lesson learned. But another important part of fiction stories is knowing the setting, or where and when a story takes place. In this particular story, our story takes place in 1963 during the Civil Rights Movement. We talked a lot about the Civil Rights Movement in February when we celebrated Black History Month, and I know you guys have covered a lot of details about it with Miss Outlaw as well. During the time of this story, Jim Crow laws were still in place in the South. Those were the laws that segregated white people and Black people. These were the laws that said white and Black people couldn't use the same restrooms or drink out of the same water fountains or go to the same restaurants. Due to these Jim Crow laws, life in the South was much more difficult for Black people during this time. Our story takes place during this time, meaning our story is historical fiction. So even though this story isn't a real story, the event of the church bombing in Birmingham is a true story. So we call this story historical fiction because the story and our characters are fictional, but the details about the history and the events are true. Due to the length of this chapter book, we're not going to have time to read the whole chapter book together. We start reading in our story today about halfway through the text. So we would have already met our characters had we have started at the beginning. The two characters I want to go over first are Kenny and Byron. Kenny is our main character and he's 10 years old. He's the middle child in his family and he is an amazing reader. Kenny is often picked on by others at school and in his neighborhood because he is so smart and because he has something called a lazy eye, which causes his eyes to look a little bit different. Byron is his older brother. He's often called By for short by his family, so you'll hear his name just be By a lot in our story. He's the oldest child in his family. Unfortunately, Byron is a huge bully who is often very unkind. He's always in trouble at school and with his family. Byron is the main reason why the family decides to travel to Birmingham. We'll learn more about that in our reading today. The three other characters you need to know about before we start reading are Joetta, Mom, and Dad. Joetta is often called Joey by her family, and she's the youngest child in the family and the only girl. She loves her older brothers, and she doesn't like it at all when Byron gets in trouble because she loves and cares for him so much. She is definitely what we would call a girly girl. She loves playing with dolls and loves dressing up. Mom is another one of our main characters. She's originally from Birmingham, Alabama. So when they travel to Alabama, they're actually traveling back to where Mom grew up. She loves her family and she wants what's best for them. We'll learn more about this in our text. Dad is our last main character. He's worked and lived in Flint, Michigan, which is where the family lives now. He loves his family and he feels that sending Byron to Alabama is what's best for Byron. Like I said earlier, we'll learn more about why they're going to Alabama in our text today. In terms of where we're picking up in our story, in the first few chapters, the author told us stories about the three children and their adventures with their family. We also learn and hear a lot of details about Byron being a bully and getting into a lot of trouble. Currently in this story, where we'll pick up today, Byron has caused a lot of trouble lately. He's taken things from a grocery store and he changed his hair without his family's permission. And those are just two of the things that he's done. Their family is working on getting their car tuned up and ready to take a trip. A couple of things we'll read about today that I want you to know about before we get started. The first one is something called an ultra glide. Back before we had CDs or we even had iPods and things like that, people played music on something called records. The ultra glide is a type of record player that you would put in your car so that you could listen to records in the car. They're also going to call their car the Brown Bomber. That's the name that they gave their car. They're going to plan and go on a road trip. In the map, you can see they're driving from A to B. They're traveling from Flint, Michigan, all the way to Birmingham, Alabama. You can tell by this map that it's going to be a very long trip for the family. The question we're focused on today is, why is the family going to Birmingham? We need to know the answer to this question before we can understand what goes on when they're there. We're picking up the story at the end of chapter 8. Children, in a little bit, Daddy's going to get some vacation time and we're going to drive to Alabama. Grandma Sands is going to keep Byron for the summer, and if things don't work out, he'll stay there for the next school year. This was too good to be true. A long trip in the Brown Bomber and no Byron for the whole summer, and probably for the whole year, because when it came to Byron, nothing ever worked out. Byron looked at Mama and Dad with his mouth wide open. We've been telling you, Byron, you've been getting warning after warning and chance after chance to straighten up. But instead of improving, you're getting worse. Do I have to remind you of the things you've done just this last year? Byron still didn't close his mouth. Mama started ticking off things that Byron called his latest fantastic adventures. You've cut school so much that Mr. Alums has come here 3 times to see what's wrong with you. You've been lighting fires. You've been taking change out of my purse. You've been in fights. You had that trouble up at Mitchell's food fair, and you had that problem with Mary Ann Hill. You set mouse traps in the backyard for birds. You fell out of that tree when you were trying to see if that poor cat always landed on its feet. You got that conch. You joined that gang. There's just too much, Byron. We can't have all this nonsense going on. I hope those weren't the only latest fantastic adventures that Mama knew about. I could list about 100 more. That's why Grandma Sands is going to look after you for a while. You're about to run us crazy. Mama changed the tone of her voice. You're going to like Birmingham, Byron. It's a lot different than Flint. There are lots of nice boys your age down there who you can be friends with. There's lots of fishing and hunting that you can do. Things are a lot better there. I love that city. Your grandma tells me it's quiet in our old neighborhood. She says that stuff on TV isn't happening around her. It's just like I remember it being. It's safe, it's quiet. Mama and Dad had threatened to send Byron to Grandma Sands about 1,000,000 times, but we never thought it would happen. This was for 3 good reasons. The first reason was that Alabama was about 2 million miles from Flint, and By knew Mama wouldn't let him ride that bus that far alone. He also knew it would be just about impossible for her to sit on a bus with him for 3 days it took to get there. The second reason was that Mama and Dad were always threatening to do stuff to Byron that everybody knew they wouldn't do. Dad had been keeping a countdown on how many more months it would be before they could force him to join the army, but we knew they wouldn't do that. But the biggest reason Byron and Joey and me thought they'd never send him to Alabama was because we had heard so many horrible stories about how strict Grandma Sands was. The thought of living with her was so terrible that your brain would throw it out as soon as it came in. Well, Byron's brain had better get used to it. We all knew by the way they'd gotten the bomber ready and by the way Mama's voice sounded that they meant it this time. The big cool baby finally shut his mouth and ran into the house. He slammed the door as hard as he could, and we all heard him say, real clear, the S word. Joey said, ooh. Dad started to go in after him, but Mama said, let him go, Daniel. He better get as much of that nonsense out of his system as he can. Grandma Sands won't be putting up with any of that mess. So the two questions we have for this particular chapter are, why are they going to Birmingham, and what are Mom and Dad hoping will happen to Byron when he's there? So far we know that they're going to Birmingham because they're dropping off Byron to live with his grandma Sands, who sounds very mean and very strict. Mom and Dad are hoping that Byron will start acting right and stop doing all of his adventures while he's living with Grandma Sands. In Chapter 9, we're going to learn more about what Dad and Mom are hoping will happen when Byron is in Alabama. Chapter 9, The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963. That Sunday I got up early. There weren't any cartoons on then, but it was always fun to wake up and not have to worry about going to school. When I got into the living room, I was surprised to see the front door open. I looked outside and saw Dad sitting in the brown bomber. I guess he was listening to records because he had his arm across the seat and was beating his hand up and down like a drum. I ran back upstairs to the bedroom and changed out of my pajamas. I peeked out of the bedroom window to make sure Dad hadn't left. He was still in the car, so I ran downstairs and through the front door. I remembered and caught the screen just before it slammed. I tapped on the window and Dad turned and smiled at me, then pointed to the passenger side for me to get in. I ran around the car and climbed in. Hey, Kenny. Hi, Dad. How'd you sleep? Okay, I guess. Go on in and get yakety yak and sit with me for a while. That's okay. I'll just listen to what you're playing. We listened to a couple of jive songs, and then I said, Dad, does Byron really have to go to Alabama? Couldn't we just drive down to about Ohio and pretend we're going to leave him to scare him? Dad looked at me and smiled kind of slow. He reached over and turned the Ultra Glide down a little. Kenneth, I know you're going to miss Byron. We all will. But son, there are some things that Byron has to learn, and he's not learning them in Flint. And the things he is learning are things we don't want him to. Do you understand? No. Dad turned the Ultra Glide down a little more. He looked like he was thinking whether or not he should tell me something. He was looking straight at me, and even though it was real hard, I looked right back at him. I tried to look real intelligent, and I guess it worked, because finally Dad said, Kenny, we've put a lot of thought into this. I know you've seen on the news what's happening in some parts of the South, right? We'd seen the pictures of a bunch of really mad white people with twisted up faces, screaming and giving dirty finger signs to some little Negro kids who were trying to go to school. I'd seen the pictures, but I didn't really know how these white people could hate some kids so much. I've seen it. I didn't have to tell Dad I didn't understand. Well, a lot of times that's going to be the way of the world for you kids. Byron is getting old enough to have to understand that his time for playing is running out fast. He's got to realize the world doesn't have a lot of jokes waiting for him. He's got to be ready. Dad looked at me again to make sure I was understanding. I nodded. Grandma Sands says it's quiet down where they are, but we think it's time Byron got an idea of the kind of place the world can be, and maybe spending some time down south will open his eyes. I nodded my head again. Mama and I are very worried because there's so many things that can go wrong to a young person, and Byron seems bound and determined to find every one of them. Now, do you really understand why we're sending Byron to Birmingham? I think so, Dad. Good, because Kenny, we've done all we can, and it seems the temptations are just too much for By here in Flint. So hopefully, the slower pace in Alabama will help him by removing some of those temptations. Hopefully he can see that there comes a time to let all of the silliness go. By'll be back, maybe at the end of summer, maybe next year. It's completely in his own hands now. I loved when Dad talked to me like I was a grown-up. I didn't really understand half the junk he was saying, but it sure did feel good to be talked to like that. It's times like this when someone is talking to you like you are a grown-up that you have to be careful not to pick your nose or dig in your drawers out of your butt. Okay, Dad, thanks. He smiled again, turned the Ultra Glide back up, and ran his hand over my head. So now that we've heard this conversation between Kenny and Dad, why does Kenny's dad think it's a good idea to send Byron to Alabama for the summer, possibly longer? I want you to answer this question in the comment section below. Make sure you come back tomorrow and listen to Miss Rondo's video because she's going to pick up the story once the family has arrived in Alabama.